The man walked into my grandmother's birthday party like he had been there before, and that was the first thing that felt wrong. It was a Saturday afternoon in late September, and we had rented out the back room of a restaurant in town for the occasion. My grandmother was turning 82, and the whole family had come together the way we only really do for birthdays and funerals. Cousins I hadn't seen in 2 years, aunts who still argued about the same things they had argued about in 1987. My grandfather sitting at the head of the table looking quietly proud the way he always did when everyone was in the same room. There were maybe 30 of us. It was loud and warm and completely familiar, and then this man walked in. He was somewhere in his 50s, well-dressed, with a leather folder under his arm and the calm, unhurried manner of someone who was used to walking into rooms where he didn't belong. He stood just inside the doorway for a moment, scanning the room, and then his eyes landed on my grandmother, and he nodded, just slightly, like they had an arrangement. I was the one who got up to intercept him. I asked him if he was looking for someone, and he said yes, that he was looking for the family of Elena Marchetti, and that he had been expecting to find us here. I told him this was a private event and asked who he was, and he handed me a card that said his name was Roberto Conti and that he was a private investigator based in Milan. I stood there holding that card, and I had absolutely no idea what to say. My cousin appeared at my elbow almost immediately, the way she always does when something is happening that she hasn't been told about, and then my uncle came over. And within about 90 seconds, there was a small cluster of us standing around this man in the doorway while the rest of the party continued behind us, oblivious. He was very calm about the whole thing. He said he understood this was unexpected, that he had tried to find a more appropriate time, but that my grandmother had specifically asked him to come today, to this party, because she wanted the family together when he delivered what he had found. I looked across the room at my grandmother. She was sitting at the center of the long table, small and white-haired and dressed in the blue cardigan she always wore for special occasions, and she was watching us with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not surprise, because she had clearly been expecting him. Something more complicated than that. Something that looked like relief and fear at the same time. She had been sick for 8 months. Not the kind of sick that gets better, the kind that moves slowly and takes things away gradually, and we had all spent those 8 months trying not to talk about what was coming while also quietly preparing for it. She knew what was happening to her. She had known for a while. My grandfather went to her side immediately when he saw our faces. He put his hand on her shoulder and leaned down and said something quietly, and she shook her head and said something back, and then she looked across the room directly at me and said, "Bring him over, sweetheart. It's time." I had never heard her use that particular tone before. Quiet and final, like a door closing gently on something that had been open for a very long time. I brought Roberto Conti across the room, and the party slowly, awkwardly, became something else entirely. My grandmother asked everyone to sit down. She said she had something to tell us, that she had been keeping it for a long time, and that she had decided she didn't want to take it with her when she left. She said it simply and without drama, the way she said most things, and the room went completely quiet. I sat down next to my grandfather, and I took his hand, and I felt him hold on tighter than usual, and I understood that he didn't know what was coming either. And then my grandmother looked at Roberto Conti and said, "Please tell them what you found." Roberto Conti opened his leather folder and set it on the table in front of him, but he didn't look at it. He looked at my grandmother first, and she nodded, and then he looked at the rest of us. He said he had been hired by my grandmother 8 months ago, almost to the day, shortly after she received her diagnosis. He said she had given him a name, a date of birth, and a city, and had asked him to find out everything he could about a man named Giuseppe Ferraro, born in Turin in 1941. Nobody in the room recognized that name. I could see it on every face around the table, the slight furrowing of brows, the exchanged glances, the silent question passing from person to person. I looked at my grandfather, and his face was very still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. Roberto Conti continued. He said that Giuseppe Ferraro had been the son of my grandmother's first husband, a man named Antonio Ferraro, who had died of a sudden illness in 1963 when my grandmother was 26 years old, and they had been married for just under 2 years. The room was completely silent. He said that Antonio had been married briefly before, very young, and that the marriage had produced a son, Giuseppe, who had been an infant when his mother died. Antonio had raised the boy alone until he met my grandmother, and when Antonio died, Giuseppe was 2 years old, and there was no one left to care for him on my grandmother's side because they had no children of their own, and she was very young and completely alone. Antonio's family had taken the boy. They had taken him back to their village in the north, and my grandmother had not seen or heard from him since. My grandmother spoke then, for the first time since she had asked us to sit down. She said he was not my blood, but he was Antonio's. And when Antonio died, I was too young and too lost to fight for him, and his family made it very clear that they did not want me involved. So I let him go. And I have thought about that every single day for 60 years. My grandfather made a sound that I had never heard from him before. Very quiet, very low, and he reached across and took her hand without saying anything. She looked at him and said, "I should have told you." I know that. But at first it felt too raw, and then too much time had passed, and then I was afraid of what you would think of me for letting a child go. So I kept it. I kept it for 60 years, and I am tired of keeping it. The room was so quiet I could hear the street outside. I looked at my mother, who was sitting across from me with tears running down her face without any apparent awareness that she was crying, and I looked at my uncle who had his hands flat on the table and was staring at them. And I looked at my grandfather, who had not let go of my grandmother's hand. Roberto Conti waited a moment and then continued. He said he had found Giuseppe Ferraro. He was 73 years old, living in a small town outside Genoa, recently widowed, with 3 grown children and several grandchildren. He had known about my grandmother. Antonio's family had told him about her when he was older, but he had never tried to make contact because he hadn't known if she would want to hear from him. He said that when he had reached out to Giuseppe on my grandmother's behalf, the man had cried on the phone. My grandmother closed her eyes when he said that. Just for a moment, and then she opened them again and she was completely composed, the way she had always been composed, the way that had always made me think she was the strongest person I had ever known. Roberto Conti reached into his folder and produced a photograph. He slid it across the table to my grandmother, and she picked it up with both hands and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then she turned it around so we could see it. It was a man. Older, gray-haired, with a wide smile and the kind of face that looked like it smiled often. He was standing in a garden with several children around him, and even across the distance of a photograph and 60 years of separation, there was something in the set of his jaw, the shape of his eyes, that reminded me of the old photographs of Antonio that my grandmother kept in a box under her bed. She said, "He looks like his father." And then she looked at Roberto Conti and said, "Did he say whether he would be willing to speak with me?" Roberto Conti said, "He said he has been hoping you would ask for 60 years. My grandmother nodded slowly, and something in her face shifted and settled in a way that I can only describe as a woman putting down something very heavy that she had been carrying for a very long time. My grandfather leaned over and said quietly, just to her, just loud enough that I could hear it from where I was sitting, "We will call him together. Whatever you need, we do it together." She turned to look at him, and she put her hand on his face, and she said, "I don't deserve you." He said, "Yes, you do. You always have." The party never really resumed after that. People sat and talked quietly, and someone brought out the birthday cake anyway, and my grandmother blew out the candles with my grandfather's hand in hers, and at some point Roberto Conti slipped out as quietly as he had arrived, leaving behind his folder and a phone number written on a card. 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning, my grandmother called Giuseppe Ferraro for the first time. I was there when she made the call, sitting across from her at the kitchen table, and I watched her hands shake slightly as she dialed, and I watched them go still when he answered. She said, "Giuseppe, this is Elena. I was married to your father. And I am so sorry it took me this long to find you." And from across the table I could hear his voice, warm and slightly rough, saying, "I always knew you would."